Hello, hello. We'll let the line populate for just a little bit, but I don't want to delay too much because we only have an hour with you this afternoon and we have a great conversation in store. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the founder and executive director of Private School Village, and I am joined by a powerhouse and a new friend. Um, I'm trying to stall just a little bit because this line always takes a second to populate. We did in our confirmation email provide Dr. Pryor's full bio, but I will introduce her in a second. I do just want to remind people that we are recording the conversation. We're going to put it on the YouTube channel, the PSV YouTube channel. And we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Pryor that is largely based on questions that were submitted in advance through the RSVP process for this conversation. We also have the Q&A feature that Zoom affords us the opportunity to use. So if we have time, you can put questions in there, and once we've gone through the questions that were pre-submitted, we will get to those questions again if time allows. Ooh, excuse me. So I'm just going to get started. We're honored to have Dr. Pryor here with us today. She's a historian of 19th century U.S. history and race. She's the author of Colored Travelers: Mobility and the Fight for Citizenship Before the Civil War, which examines Black activism and the fight against segregation long before Rosa Parks. Her award-winning scholarship on the N-word, including her widely watched TED Talk, Why It's So Hard to Talk About the N-word, has helped shape national conversations about language, race, and power. She's a distinguished professor at Smith College. She's connecting the history of anti-Blackness to our present moment. This year in particular, she's teaching a course, Richard Pryor's America. You may see her on Instagram talking about it, and I'm loving following along on that. It's a course that explores the life, influence, and legacy of her father, Richard Pryor, that Richard Pryor. She's blending, oh, I lost my moment. I lost my place. This is a class that blends history, culture, cultural analysis, and personal reflection, just in time for her forthcoming book, somewhat on the similar subject, called Something We Said, Richard Pryor, A Notorious Word, and Me, which is coming out in June. Today, she brings the same depth and insight into the conversation on the history and meaning of the N-word for the private school village community, and we are so grateful and so excited to have this conversation. So, Dr. Pryor, thank you for joining us today. And if we could get started with maybe you sharing just a bit about how you came to focus on the N-word and your evolving career path.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And um, yeah, well, I did not certainly want to study I didn't set out to study the N-word. That wasn't what I had in mind. But I was in my first year of teaching here at Smith College, a 19th century US history course, and a white student in my class said the N word. She was quoting a line from a movie, and she said the N word. She wasn't calling anyone a name, but I just was not prepared. And I completely like froze in the moment. I did not know how to handle it and what to do. And it actually was a line from a movie called Blazing Saddles, which is a movie that my dad co-wrote. So she was essentially quoting my dad to me. And so my head was firing on all cylinders. And it sent me on a journey about, how do I weigh the question of historical accuracy around what I saw happen before my very eyes when this word kind of unexpectedly entered my classroom.
Was that the
And
first time? Was that the first time you'd had an experience with the word that way?
in that kind of academic, in that particular kind of academic way. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes. I mean, my what I came to find as I started digging more deeply is that in some ways the N word was like a kind of a pin on a roadmap of my entire life. Like I could chart much of my life in terms of my relationship to this word. And that is the sort of framework of my memoir that's going to be coming out in June that you spoke about. So, yeah.
Wow. But so back then when this happened, you weren't thinking I'm going to one day teach a course about this.
Never.
So then back us up even further and give us a little bit of framing about who you were as a student. Because a lot of people joining us today, we're in predominantly white institutions and we have children in these schools, and it just would be really interesting to know what type of student you were. Did you go to public or private school? How did that experience shape you? And is there anything related to being othering by that word or any other kind of
Mhm.
experience that informed who you are today?
Well, I actually went to Westlake School, what was then Westlake School for Girls, which is now Harvard Westlake. I graduated a long time ago, and and what kind of student was I? I mean, I was actually a hot mess of a student. I have to I have to admit, I was really good at writing, and I love the theater, and I don't remember any much else about the kinds of ways, but I know that I was I one of my girlfriends, when I started doing this work, one of my girlfriends said to me, I remember in the 11th grade when they taught The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and you said, I don't want to listen to those girls say the frickin' N-word. I said it, I'm sure, in much more colorful terms, but but I didn't even remember that.
Yeah,
But it was interesting to me that it stood out for one of my friends, because I think the the ways in which I came in contact and confronted that word, the constant confrontations I had with it were so familiar that I almost didn't even register them at the time as being remarkable.
right. So, talk to us a little bit about this word. So, from my naive vantage point, I don't believe this word is just any other type of slur.
Mhm.
But I would love to know your thoughts about it, given that you have this breadth of knowledge about the history of it and the impact of it. Why is it so topical and timely? I mean, just a few weeks ago, or was it even just a few weeks ago, a week ago on international television, and the fallout from that, it seems like almost every day we're hearing of stuff. It makes me wonder what we're not hearing about.
Mhm.
But give us a little bit of framing of this word, if you can, given the history of it and why you think it is where it is today.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously the word is deeply rooted in the history of enslavement in the United States, and um, goes back all the way. I mean, I actually have a friend who teaches a medieval history course and about race, and the N word is being used, in the 1500s, and to kind of separate people racially, but um, but it starts in kind of this U.S. context, in the colonial period, being used as a word to mark people by the color of their skin. And a lot of times my students will say to me that, oh, the N word is, yeah, it comes from slavery. That's why it's so bad. But what I try to point out to them is actually the when the word really becomes vicious is when Black people start to become free. So it's like in the 20s in the northern part of the United States. This is before slavery ends in 1865, for everyone, but it starts to end in the North. And that's when we see it shape into the kind of slur that we know it to be today, because it's applied to people who aren't simply holding a particular labor category, right? They're involuntary laborers. It's in perpetuity, like, it passes from the mother to the child and on and on. But now it's to people, this framework of of worth or worthlessness is being applied to people who are free too. And that's the real game changer of the
Yeah.
word.
So I remember speaking with you many years ago, and one of the things that I learned in that conversation, I feel like every time I talk to you, I am perpetually learning something new about this word in our history. But you highlighted then the use of it by our own people in a comedic way very early on. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Right. So, I've written an article about this. One of the questions that was interesting to me as a historian, I felt kind of clear about how it works as a tool of white supremacy. Like that felt clear, but I could never really understand why would Black people use a word that was meant to subjugate them?
Yeah.
Like, why would that become part of African American vocabulary? And what my research really showed is that Black people were using this word as a kind of political tool, not just in the 1970s when my father did it on stage, but way back to the 1770s when, I have all kinds of evidence, and many people didn't like it. But there were some people who called each other this word as a way to, not as as a kind of camaraderie to show that they were part of the same group and that they understood who they were and they weren't afraid of that condition. And it was like a kind of social protest.
Yeah. Yeah. I almost feel like it helped us reclaim a little bit of ourselves, right?
Mhm.
Almost not as much, a victim of it. But I think that is lent to it being so confusing for people today. So we have families who are trying to really figure out how to educate their children about the use of the word.
Mhm.
You have family members using the word, but you're
Mhm.
also trying to like
Mhm.
educate them as to why maybe they shouldn't use it's. I feel like we're all kind of all over the place, and there's no
Mhm.
standards or norms. And then you throw in being in a predominantly white institution where lots of non-melanated people want to also either get passes to use the word or feel very comfortable because they are so culturally accepted that they feel comfortable using this word. Talk to us about the complexity of the word and how we get to a place where there is a broader understanding so that it is less problematic, particularly for our children. Ooh, I stumped you.
That
I
you did
stumped you.
when you said so it's less problematic. I was like, ooh. But I think what's really interesting is I've talked to a lot of young people about this, um, many, and it seems like there's a coming of age moment around the N word for Black kids, and maybe even all teenagers.
Yeah,
But certainly for Black teenagers, that sometime around 11, 12, 13, you get to assert yourself around this word. Who do I want to be in relationship to this word? And it was funny because there was a play, and I'm not gonna remember the name of this play. It's a beautiful Black play on Broadway, and I was called in to do the kind of talk back afterwards because the N word is a big part of the show. And all of the actors were young Black men, like in their 20s. And I was saying this, there's a coming of age where you might even invite your white friends to use the word. That's part of the process around it. And one of them was like, no, I would never do that. And then another guy said, wait, you're going to tell me when you were 12 years old, you never told one of your white friends they could use the N word? Like, and he was like, well, I mean, but I was 12. And he's like, well, that's what we're talking about. So why is it like what are, young kids getting in that moment, or other kids who are like, I'm never using that word. I'm not going to use that word. And then might kind of position themselves as being uncool, or what my students called suspect, by not using it.
right.
So it is really complicated. And I think it's um, because this kind of social protest it's recognized around the word, that even white people think they can step in, they can miss all the young white kids, they can miss all the work, they can miss all the history, and just jump into being a person who uses it in a way that's not offensive, right?
Yeah.
That they can use it in this other kind of way. And it's really not possible. It's really not possible. So I don't know. Are young people doing that? Are you finding that in your community that young kids are doing that? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And so, it was kind of a trick question because I live in this space of thinking we need to just get to the point where we accept that, like our history, this word is just messy and complicated, and there's no easy way around it, right? And because of that, there's a certain amount of grace and education and engagement we need to be having with our schools around this word because we can't expect them if it is confusing for our own families, right? So, um, but that makes me wonder, is there any other word like it?
Hmm.
Have you come across any other word that, as
Hmm.
you say, is a coming of age experience? And I totally agree. But do you
Hmm.
find that to be the case for other slurs or other, again,
Hmm.
I live in this space of thinking this word deserves its own special category. It is
Hmm.
not a typical slur. There's so much layered history and so much complicated nuances today. This isn't a word of the past, just a word of the past. Like it has taken on so many nuances since. And so for me, I feel like the mistake is that we try to treat it like every other slur.
Hmm. Like a cuss word, and it really is not. I
Yeah.
think it really is not because of the kind of profundity of anti-Blackness in the United States. I think that maybe if there was a little more flexibility around anti-Blackness, if it wasn't so um, uh, I don't know what the word is I'm thinking of, but it's like so foundational to American ideologies, then then maybe like I was just talking about this with my students. Part of the Richard Pryor class is a family history, and I was surprised at how many of my students were doing stories of immigration in the 20th century, and some of them were Irish immigrants, and some of them were, Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And in each of those cases, we talked about how, there are all these books written, how the Irish became white, how the Jews became white, how the Italians became white. And much of this process of these people who weren't initially really even considered white when they, first came to the United States, that process of whitening them was anti-Blackness,
Hmm.
you know and my dad even has a joke around this, something with Vietnamese, immigration and refugees in the 70s, and said, they're learning the N word so they can become good citizens, and this is the actually the process throughout US history is you learn anti-Blackness so you can become a true American.
Yeah. You posted not too long ago about how Webster's in 1998 updated the definition. And I was like, first of all, I was like, that's not that long ago. And second of all, I'm like, I'm 53 years old and I'm just learning this. Can you please share with us what you posted and your thoughts about
Yeah,
that?
yes. And I can also say reluctantly updated the definition, fought back about it. Wasn't like so for those who weren't following me on social media, the eh, the Merriam-Webster's defined the N-word, the actual N-word in the dictionary as a Black person, comma, usually derogatory, up until 1998.
Say that one more time. You glitched just a little bit.
Okay. A Black person, comma, usually derogatory. That's the definition of the N-word. And and there was actually a Black woman in Michigan who made it her mission to start, fighting against this, like
Oh,
kind of made it her own process, and the NAACP picked it up. But even then, Merriam-Webster's was like, no, we're good. And it just took a tremendous amount of backlash for them to consider changing the definition. I mean, now it's much more, thorough and thoughtful, but at the time that wasn't the case. And that's 1998. I
yeah.
mean, that's the year my daughter was born, who's 27 years old. So, yeah.
Speaking of being a parent, you are a parent. Did you ever have any roles in your family around this word as a child yourself and or as a parent now?
I mean, it's really interesting, and I'm sure this is true of your families as well, which is that some of them, which is my husband is white, and my children do not present necessarily as African American to somebody looking on. So have kind of had that struggle in their own lives. As especially living where we live now, which is in Western Massachusetts, which is not particularly diverse. Um, and what I felt, and I still sort of believe, is that this is a word, like using this word is about authenticity. And if it was authentic to your family, and that's something your family uses to express themselves in particular ways, the novelist Gloria Naylor talks about this in a 19th, a very kind of famous 19, I think 86 or 85 editorial, where she talks about how in, the living rooms of Harlem, this word meant something very different than it meant in, the kind of white racist version of the word, and that she grew up with that. My father grew up with a version of that word in the 1940s, and it was super authentic to their household. It wasn't authentic to mine,
Yeah.
and so there would be no reason for my children to adopt it. But I will tell you that my son, both of them have had to stick up for themselves around it and come and speak up for themselves. And my son was constantly badgered for the N-word pass when he was 12, 13, 14 years old, that his friends like, come on, can't we say it? Please give us permission. And he's like, I'm not, first of all, I'm not giving you that permission. And like, I don't even know why you're asking me. Like, just because I'm African American, like to give you that's weird. But it is something that he had to confront and make social choices around, right? So they're not easy social choices to make when you're 12 or 13 and people are badgering you for stuff.
Yeah. You're trying to figure out so much other stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. I don't know that that is happening as much today. I hope it is happening less and less. I know it's still being used, usually in offensive ways, intentionally.
Mm,
So there was actually a
mm.
question about the use of Negro in classroom space.
Okay.
The person said,
Yeah.
I have found that students feel that though it is not the N word, it is still jarring to hear in an academic context, particularly in a majority white space. And that question really resonates with me.
This one was so, I went to a school in Springfield, and I was talking to an AP literature class. Most of the students were Black and Latino. And I talk to students a lot of times about this kind of linguistic intervention that young people have made around the hard ER and the soft A to differentiate the different usages of the N word. And one of the students raised their hand, and I was like, so I raised this. I was like, what are the different kind of these different linguistic categories? And somebody said the ER, and somebody said the A, and I was about to stop going, and somebody was raising their hand, and they were like, and the O. And I was like, oh, that's so sad that they can't spell here. That was my first reaction. And then she told me what she meant, and I was like, oh. And then I've heard it over and over and over again that students don't want to hear this word. They don't want to hear this. This is the N word to them. And there, I have a colleague, Patrick Real, who's a historian of 19th century history and African American history, who studies the N word as well. And he says that they're basically the same word, back in that time, and that they're just kind of pronounced differently, but they are the same word. So the students aren't entirely off. It's hard to get around when Black people were using the word in more formal and button up ways to describe themselves, like with the word colored, like
Mhm.
is it United Negro College Fund? I mean, like there are these spaces where it's hard not to use the word, but they do not like it, and they push back against it for sure.
That was a first for me to hear that question. I'm gonna be more mindful in tapping into parents to see if they've also heard that from their kids or even my own kids, because I think it's a valid concern. So can we talk a little bit about your daddy?
Of course.
He had a pretty complicated relationship with this word, did he not?
He did. I My dad, it was I think 1971 when my dad first, well, that's not true. Even earlier, he had a character, Super N-word, in the 60s that he was playing with in his comedy, and kind of thinking around what that meant. And of course, it was like Clark Washington, who could, leap a slum in a single bound, right? And but he started to kind of be influenced by the Black Power movement and this Black Power usage of the N word more in the early 70s, and brought that into his comedy. Of course, two of his Grammy Award winning albums have the N word in the title, which was incredibly, I think it's hard for us to even recognize right now how groundbreaking of a statement that was, especially, for a Black artist to kind of welcome what that, say, I'm not afraid of being associated with this. I'm not afraid, this is at the kind of like a peak of respectability politics where Black people who were um, kind of venerated and held in high esteem often, recoiled from this language, understandably. And my dad was embracing it and embracing the way that he heard it in his childhood home and bringing it into his comedy. And it's the part of the way that he reached Black audiences. He said, I'm going to be myself out here on these stages. And then towards the end of the end of the decade, he went to Africa, like many Black people did in the 1970s, on this kind of journey home of rediscovery. And he had a complete about face about it and felt like when he was there, he didn't hear the word or think about the word, and it didn't work in a Black context. And that he realized that this was a word that was unique to this, predominantly white space, and that he felt like it was not working for him anymore, and he disavowed it.
Mhm. Wow. Incredible, because so much of his comedy. And I think it's a blessing that we have his work and we have other comedians who have kind of had similar experiences around this word, because this word is so layered and has caused so much harm. I think you almost have to have the comedic or the ability to laugh or something associated with it so that we can be in conversation about it. It makes
Mhm,
it takes the sting out of it a little bit, if you will. Like, because again, like there's so much to this, and we could talk for hours about it and still be back at square one when it comes to, well, what do we do next around this word?
mhm,
How do we
mhm,
harness this word? How do we take it out of our lexicon? Is
mhm.
that
I
ever
mean,
a possibility?
I like that word harness because I think that's exactly what my dad did. And I mean, he wasn't the only person to do it. What he did do differently was he did it in front of mixed race audiences.
Yeah,
And he made his audiences reckon with it. So it
yeah,
wasn't just a using of it, but it was kind of a reckoning.
Yeah.
for himself and everyone else. And he used it. My dad, part of his comedy, as I'm teaching this class, I'm seeing in a way that I don't think I even fully appreciated before is like he's constantly taking on new characters. And a lot of those characters is he does white people.
Uh-huh.
And so he does, he does the white version of using this word. He does, the version of his father, the version of, kids of, his peers. He has all different people using the word in all different kinds of ways. And it's really fascinating to watch how he kind of he owns it.
Yeah. Tell us more about your class. When you were first, I think you were going into your first class, you were posting about being nervous. But I'm
Yeah.
really curious to know how the students are responding and what you're finding and learning from them.
Well, I mean, my students are brilliant at Smith College. They really are. You can the wonderful thing about teaching here is that you can bring any big mess into the classroom and they'll make it come together. But a lot of that is, I don't usually teach the 20th century. So right there, I'm like out of my element and learning with my students, and they love him. They are loving and breaking it down and making connections between how often he conjures slavery in his work and what that must have meant for him and what he was trying to say, that he's like, even when it sounds like it's almost like a kind of trickery, like he's doesn't sound particularly political when he's saying something. He takes you on this long road and then he gets you there. He's
Mhm.
like, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that we are positioned in a certain way in this country and we're treated in a certain way. One of his great lines is like, about the Martian landing. He's like, black people, N words, he says, aren't afraid of anything after 400 years of this shit. And so, he's constantly aware and constantly playing with the idea. Another thing that, is in the writing about him, but that my students keep emphasizing, is that in performing these white characters, as he does all this role playing in his comedy, he makes whiteness performable. So he's like kind of takes away the idea that the standard is white and then there's black. I don't know if you remember this from growing up. Like, you'd be watching the news and they'd be like, a man robbed a bank, a man did this, and then a black man did this, right? They just wouldn't say the race if it
Right.
was a white person, as if that was some kind of standard. And by performing whiteness in the way that he does, my dad says, no, whiteness isn't a standard. Whiteness is as much a thing that people put on and wear and perform as anything else.
Yeah. Wow. And so your students are, how are they responding to all of this?
They love it. They think he's brilliant. They call him out um on his misogyny. I had a moment where I was like, there was a particular piece that I was like, "Ugh, oh my gosh," and I kind of felt embarrassed, like now, sitting around with my students, and they were like, they got so much more out of it than even I did, and we're like, no, 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 but this is why this is brilliant. This is why this is working, and
Yeah.
um. So yeah, they're a lot of fun to be pulling up the shirt sleeves with and doing this work for
Are they
sure.
coming to your class with their own experiences with this word?
It's funny, we just on Thursday really started talking about the N word
Okay.
because we've been talking about all this other, stuff around his comedy. But, I think that they have a lot of they have an unprocessed relationship generally, my students, unless they've done work. I mean, and that's part of why I wrote the book that I did, and what my TED talk is about, is I really think there's so much room for using conversations about the N word as sort of a platform for I mean, it's really a conversation about race. And if we can use this as like a jumping off point, because it is like it's a common ground. Everybody comes to this. Everybody comes to this and has. I met one student from Martha's Vineyard, a white student who said she had never thought about the N word before, but every other person has been put into a social situation, a difficult conversation, whether they're white, black, or
Yeah.
something else. Yeah.
She's got to be the only person in the history of America.
I
Uh,
was surprised. I was like, maybe, maybe not. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit more about it being an a door opener for a conversation. So if I'm a parent and I'm trying to figure out how to have this conversation with my child, knowing, you know, um, developmentally, it is probably about to really enter into their sphere. How do you suggest they do that? Or how did you even do that when your son was coming to you and saying, these kids are asking me for a pass? And I love the wherewithal he had to be like, why are you asking me? And no. But did you have a
Mhm.
conversation with him before that or not? Because I'm finding that a lot of times our kids are having these experiences. They're not telling us. And so if you're not proactively opening that door and having the conversation, it's happening anyway.
I always make the connection between sex before sex education. I mean, this is you're right. It's happening anyway. So you're either going to talk about it or not, but they're grappling with it. They are grappling with it. And my son was really interesting. My son has ADHD, so he had a lot of blurting and he was afraid of that in himself. So I used to read him. This is like terrible parenting 101, but I used to read him like at night, like from Frederick Douglass's life narrative and stuff. And it was like, don't read that to your kids at night, by the way.
I'm
But
really curious to know how that happened, but we'll come back to that.
but I wanted them to know stuff. I mean, anyway, yes. Uh I'll just say briefly, like they got a lot of gruff as like very light-skinned people, that they weren't really black, and I needed them to understand that there were a lot of very white-looking black people who experienced enslavement, and that did not separate. Don't let people tell you that you don't have this shared experience if ju for this reason alone. I mean, there are certainly different experiences that, around color that kids have. But that was my thinking. But no, don't do that. But Frederick Douglass and others in these writings talk about the N word. And when I read it to my son, I would read it to him and say the N word, not say the actual word.
Mhm.
But for his generation, in some ways, the phrase the N word is almost a direct conduit to the actual N word. So he was afraid if he heard the phrase the N word too much, he might blurt the word. Like
Oh,
this is when he was like 7 and 8 years old. And so he asked me, and we started in our house when I read it just to say N, because that it was almost like the N word was too close to that violence for him.
great.
So that was real. That was something really, I thought that was really interesting.
And he was 7?
Yeah, he's very smart. He's very verbal and very smart. Yeah.
Yeah. Good job, Mom. That was early. So many parents think, oh, it's too early, like don't want the innocence to be harmed. And maybe come middle school, we'll have this conversation. Wow.
Well, in everything I mean, in almost everything I've read, something happens at age 6 and 7 where, you know, people are called this word that maybe it's not this word, but they're told something else. Um, there's some kind of awareness that starts happening around that age. And I think for me, it was important that my kids weren't blindsided by it.
Yeah. The word we hear anecdotally a lot is monkey.
Mm.
Elementary school. Yep.
Mm.
Yep. And then there is a lot of
Mm,
conversation about white families who call their own children monkeys in kind of an endearing way. And so there's often a larger conversation around um, that's why it shows up at school.
mm,
Yeah,
mm,
we've lots of work to do.
mhm,
Lots of work to do.
mhm,
Fast forward for me. So for students, I remember being in middle school and being the only one in the classroom and shriveling. I mean, you just feel the eyes on you. You're sweating like you're a perimenopausal woman, like not fun. What advice, two questions. What advice do you have for students who may be going through
mm,
that for the first time?
mm,
And what do you wish you had known?
mhm.
Now that you're older, what do you wish your younger self, excuse me, had known that might have helped you?
I mean, this is I'm going to start with the second question, which I think is a beautiful question. And I wish I understood that I wasn't alone, that there was a community, and that by embracing that community, I was so afraid of not fitting in with my friends that I was afraid of embracing other Black kids because I was afraid that that would be, kind of, proof in the pudding that I was so much different than everybody else, which is the last thing I wanted to be. I never wanted to be white. I never thought I was white, but I didn't want it to mean something that I was Black. I
Mm.
didn't want that. And I was afraid of that. And I wish I knew I didn't have to be afraid of that, that, that I could have been in community, that there could have been, um, I could have found out easily, like somebody, oh, he called you the N-word, he called me the N-word. Like I had a conversation with a couple of friends, as I was interviewing for the book, a couple of friends who went to Harvard who said, Black friends who were like, oh yeah, like somebody that I have an incident with in high school that I write about. Um, that guy like literally constantly, like it was constant that this person would call us that word, like, and I never knew that then.
Wow.
Yeah. The first question, what would I tell Mike? Is the first question, what would I tell young people? I mean, I just think it's real. I think it's almost the same. It's so important to be in community, like that you don't have to go through those moments of feeling so alone, the spotlight on you. I say this in my TED talk. Like one of my students said that she felt like her classmates were bobbleheads, that as soon as the N word came up, they were like, turning to her and
Right.
waiting for her response, and how terrifying that was too, because all of a sudden you're, you know, 13 years old and you're representing the race.
Yeah. Something you said, I think, is like the framing that every parent needs to remember. Like in adolescence, you're trying to fit in. You're not trying to really stand out. And things like this make us stand out. And that can be really, really hard.
Mhm. For
Talk to
sure.
us about this new book. But wait. Before you do, how did you become a writer?
A writer. Well, I always wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to sit in, my dad had an IBM typewriter and I would just sit there like everybody else was out playing and I was like, but I, I kind of stopped. I don't know. And that's, I think, why I love being a historian so much is I love like uncovering and discovering and, putting the stories together. Um, but yeah, I always love to write. But even then, I remember at Harvard Westlake, I mean at Westlake, I was in the 11th grade. I remember I wrote this like I thought it was so good about Midsummer Night Dream and essay, and the teacher said, a white teacher said to me, if I was going to use Cliff Notes, that I needed to cite them. and he gave me an A, but this is the note that he wrote.
Right.
And I did not use Cliff Notes.
Yeah.
And so there was always these weird kinds of forms of discouragement.
Yeah.
I remember working on a screenplay about this idea I had, and of course the main character was like me. And one of my girlfriends, who was white, said, "Why is she black? If she has to be, it has to have a reason to be black. You can't just have a black character. This is in the 1980s, right?" And so, these are the kinds of, so I got a lot of discouragement. I think there was like a coming home for me too in working on I had a lot of help. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna, I mean, I had a lot of people, a lot of editors, especially my best girlfriend who went to Westlake, who's white, who's a producer and who came in as a developmental editor and really helped me. But the book ended up being the book I had always fantasized about. Yeah.
Yeah. So this book is coming out in June. What is it called? And tell us a little bit about it.
The book is called Something We Said. Richard Pryor, A Notorious Word, and Me, about the N word. It is part memoir, it is part historical exploration of the N word. And like I said, kind of follows my own trajectory around the N word. And at the heart of the book is my relationship with my father. Because in many ways, I was the last one to know that my interest in the N word had anything to do with him. And it's sort of that kind of discovery for me as well. My father died in 2005 after complications from multiple sclerosis, and the end of his life was really, really difficult. And I think, part of the the trauma of that ending and our complicated relationship all along, because my dad was complicated, and I probably am too, and made me forget a little bit about how tender my relationship with him and so with him was. And so writing this book kind of helped me to get in touch with that. And so did the journey around the N word.
It's crazy that you were the last to know, but we were
The
preparation
very last.
for this call. We had a conversation, and she and I first talked shortly after COVID, and I remember thinking then, like, there's so many layers and connections here, and I don't think she sees it.
I
Or else,
didn't.
or else I thought, oh, she's purposely not seeing it. Like it was glaringly obvious.
Yeah, yeah, just obtuse. I wasn't
I
trying
wanted to
to
be like,
not say anything.
P.S., do you know who your dad is? But, and here we are. So everything in its time.
It's fun getting to embrace him. I feel like yeah, it's like it's some kind of like homegoing. It's been really cool.
That is
Yeah.
great. There is a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Is asking about books, about learning about the N word in the classroom setting. And this to me harkens back to one of the questions that I also had is who do you look to uh,
Hmm.
around expertise and guidance around this word and around talking to children about complicated things like the N word, particularly for non-Black students?
Hmm. For non-Black students. Um, yeah, I don't, I don't, I don't know about that, but there's a wonderful essay by a writer called Emily Bernard, which was teaching the N-word. I think it's a Black professor in all-white classroom and the word nobody will say.
Mm.
And very much the inspiration for the kind of work that I wanted to do around this, which was like it was really impossible for me to do this work in even in my classroom without recognizing and reconciling with how personal it was going to be. I mean, I wasn't going to be able to talk about this in this like objective way. And there are people who have. Um, there's a professor in Arizona, Neil Lester, who does work around it. But I just felt like you couldn't extract one from the other. And I think that's really what my story is all about is the way this is so much about these intimacies around race and identity that come up every time, you're confronting the word. Um, Another writer, of course, is Randall Kennedy, who has a kind of a beautiful history, and um, Jabari Assim has a great word. I mean, a great book about it. Um, but also there really wasn't any. I think there's like a teaching tolerance website does some work around it, but honestly, there's not that much.
Yeah.
There's really not that much about how to navigate this.
Yeah. Or if there is, I feel like a lot of it is relegated to the history.
Or, or like what I saw students tell me again and again is their teachers told them one of three things. Never, ever, ever, ever say this word.
Mhm.
You must say this word, which isn't just the racists aren't just teaching that. That's sometimes there are there maybe not now, but there were progressive teachers who are like, you have to say this word to understand its power and hurt,
Right.
although it still doesn't make perfect sense to me. Or the third one is you decide for yourself, but there is a decision to be made, but you, 11-year-old, while reading To Kill a Mockingbird, you decide for yourself. And what none of these versions did was gave students the tools to be able to make that decision or understand why their teachers made those decisions. And so it again, like sex, right? Just don't do it, right?
Mhm.
That's the answer instead of really talking them through it. And so this is why I advocate so much for conversation, because I think there really does need to people need to be able to understand what's going on. And it's really hard, especially when some of the folks who are like setting trends for global fashion and music and trends are using it, so like, how do you say no to that?
Yeah. Do you do you buy the notion of there being many different words out of this word? Do you
I mean,
subscribe?
I write about that.
Yeah.
I think it's like a homonym,
Okay.
100%. Yes, there's no question there's two words here to me. um do they blend together? Yes, they do. Is it so clean cut that, like, I often hear people say, this white person called me the N word with the hard ER. And I'm like, there's no other version that that person could be using,
Right.
because that's how that you can't, in my opinion, you cannot be a white person using the soft GA. That's something um, that's born out of culture and hardship and experience. And if you don't have that, you're not saying it with the soft GA.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another question. How does she feel about the word being introduced in fictional literature?
I mean, it is in literature, a lot of literature, right? But I I increasingly don't see a reason for it. But 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 there are, because if you're talking about something that really happened to somebody, right? If you're trying to replicate this real thing that happened, but I remember reading Nicola Yoon. I don't know, like The Sun Is Also a Star. Like this is a young adult. It's maybe even younger than a young adult um, writer, but a beautiful writer, and she is Black. And she writes this like love story about a Black girl, I think in New York or maybe LA, who ends up, maybe it's in New York, who ends up spending the day with a young Korean guy, and they like basically have like the most romantic day, and it's really beautiful. And there's a moment where his family meets her, and his brother goes to say it, and but he doesn't. The character doesn't. And I asked her, was that a conscious choice? Like to, and she's like, yeah, and you saw it coming, you knew it was coming, but
Mhm.
I didn't actually have. I was thinking about the young Black girls who are going to be reading this book. Did they actually, in order to have that experience, did they have to actually read the word while they were in that book? And she said, I didn't think so. And that's who I was writing the book for. And so I think about that
Yeah.
when, yeah.
Excellent. We are quickly approaching the 4 o'clock hour. I wanted to leave some space just in case there were any parting words or anything you wanted to leave us with. Having intimately studied this word and spent so much time with it, and considering you're speaking to an audience that is on an educational journey, where again we could talk about this, we will talk about this word annually, but like clockwork, it is coming up in our schools because
Yeah.
of children. So I just wanted to leave some space to see if you had any final thoughts for us around the N word.
Well, I mean, I forgot to mention my article, which is Etymology of N-word, which I would not have used the actual N-word in the title today, but I did when I wrote it in 2016. Um, Etymology of N-word, about the use of the word in the early 19th century. You can download it on Smith Scholar Works online. Um, and I guess I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but having forums and spaces I imagine first, I would want to have my kids around other kids like them. Do you know what I mean? Like having Black kids being able to talk only with other Black kids about what was happening for them before they had to have these kinds of conversations in, the white classroom, like my daughter did when she was in the 10th grade, and the teacher said, there are no Black students in here, so we can't really have an opinion about how we feel about the N-word. And my daughter, who was like, 15 years old, is like, actually I'm Black. And I mean it, like, so before they're in that
Yeah.
space, if there are chances to just talk about what does this feel like, what would you say, how would you say this to a teacher, how would you let them know? Because I think the conversation is everything. I think it's happening whether we like it or not. um I think one thing I didn't really talk about is, in terms of outlawing it, like in making like a zero tolerance policy. One thing that always terrifies me about that is, at least in my reading, and this is maybe only anecdotal, but it seems like it's Black people and Black children who end up, getting the brunt of the discipline and punishment around that. And so if there's some other way to build strength and community, early enough to have the kids in conversation so they know what to say when it comes their way and they're not alone.
Yeah. Love that idea. And I will extend it to also include parents also need to be in community around this word. There's a comment in the uh, chat thing about middle school teachers having books that have the N word in it. And that to me is a conversation that parents need to be having so that then you can collectively and individually, talk about that with your school community. There's so many layers.
Definitely, definitely. I mean,
Layers
that's so hard. So I mean, those are, I think, really questions, like, so that you're not surprised when you're doing a read aloud, that you're ending up with this, word in the classroom, and the teachers are thinking about it before they,
Yeah.
preparing. Mhm.
And there's so much that impacts around this world. There's just so much that impacts the child, like in covert and overt ways, like just seeps into who they're going to become. And so, all the more reason why we are grateful to be in conversation with you on this word. We are eagerly anticipating the release of your book. And
I want to say I am doing an event on May 31st at Book Soup. So, anybody want to come? Four
yes,
o'clock. I would love
we
to
will
see
be
you all.
there. We will be there and we will continue this conversation because I do feel strongly that PSV has a responsibility really to kind of make sure this conversation is at the forefront of conversations within all of our schools because it is a coming of age experience and it is something that impacts us all except for your one student in Martha's Vineyard from Martha's.
Exactly.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Pryor, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.